Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. Thanks for joining us for this special episode where we pull back the curtain on the creative process of developing adult visual novels. Now let's get seedy.
Today we'll be answering two related questions. The first question comes from a user on Reddit who asked, "It would be interesting to be able to look over your shoulder as you develop the games. What is the path from the idea to the next update? Is there a storyboard? What comes first? The graphic or the text? How are animations created?"
And then another one of the questions that we're going to answer this episode came from a fellow adult game developer duo, Alterworlds, who asked, "I'd be curious to see what your division of labor is and how you make major decisions about the writing, characters, etc. I know it's probably more of a boring question, but it's what I, as a developer, am curious about, especially as I don't know about many other duo developers."
So when we decided to do this as a business full-time, I started working on the business full-time in the summer of 2021, and the Omega was still working at his regular job full-time. And I'm a pretty organized person. I would say that's one of my strengths. And every job I've had, that's been typically one of my duties is to organize things and kind of create a workflow. So I spent a lot of time that first year just really kind of documenting and paying attention to what we had to do to get an update together, and then taking time to step back and reflect and see if there was ways that we could make it more efficient or tighten up the process. We didn't really have a workflow for Prince of Suburbia at that time, as it was kind of a part-time project. So things just kind of happened when they happened, and it all got slapped together whenever the people that were working on it had time to put it together. But as we took more control over it, you started coding Prince of Suburbia. We were doing all the coding and all the art for A Shot in the Dark because we had more control over the process and there was less other people involved. We were able to get a more efficient workflow going. So I actually have a document now that goes through the entire workflow of what goes into making an update, and it has all the little individual tasks that we would need to do in order to get the update out. It's especially useful because it has all the little tasks that we might forget or that we kind of forget about when we're putting an update together. One of my favorite quotes about game development is that the last 20% takes 80% of the time. And that's often because there are all these little things that in your mind, you're like, oh, this is just a little thing, I'll handle it later. But there's a lot of little things. And so all those little things add up and you get this feeling that you're like almost done. But then what's left is all the little tiny things. And each one of those things can take more time than you think they will. And there's always more of those things than you think that there are. So now we have a really nice list of all the little tasks that go into it. And I update it after every update if we've added new things that we have to do or if there was things that we forgot to do. And I use an app called ClickUp, which is kind of like Trello or any other project management type software, where I put all of the tasks in for every update. And that usually takes me about a day at the beginning of the update cycle, but it saves us a lot of time later on because it allows us to make comments and to take notes or put notes for the other person or assign tasks to the other person. And it keeps everything organized. So I think that saves us a lot of time. And that's something that has evolved as we've, built this business. We've gotten more organized with that. But yeah, that's kind of my contribution to that part of it.
I think an important note with the ClickUp stuff and the organizational stuff when it comes to these projects is they're really important. Like if you have a very complex kind of game that you're working on, if you have a game that's a little more straightforward, like you just have to make the renders, the story, and you don't really have any branching, it's just linear, it's much simpler. And that kind of goes back to Prince's Suburbia in comparison to A Shot in the Dark. The complexity level between those two games is ginormous. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, it's night and day. When I'm setting up the tasks for Prince of Suburbia, it's essentially like, we have a scene for every character. So you have to have a task for the art for it, the writing for it, and then the coding for it. And then, once those things are coded, there's not really much additional coding that has to happen. There's a few things that happen at the beginning of an update. There's a few things that happen when you're making the final build and the Android build and things like that. But, it has far less tasks for sure than A Shot in the Dark has a lot of tasks. And then, for example, last update, we added the walkthrough feature. So we had to add a bunch of tasks that are now things that we have to do every update in order to have the walkthrough feature work. And so, it's another thing that we talked about too, is that with A Shot in the Dark, we've talked about potentially consolidating the future content into longer updates less frequently, which we know isn't ideal for players, but would actually save a lot of development time because there are so many tasks that have to be done just when we release an update. And with A Shot in the Dark, that piece of it takes like a month in and of itself. And so the less updates we have, the more months we actually save in the long run. So that's something that I'm sure players don't want to hear, but it's something that we've learned about the development process.
Right. And as far as that 1 month that Jocelyn's talking about, the testing is a huge part of that, because in a shot in the dark, especially because of all the branches. So that's one thing to consider. Like if you're thinking about making a complex game, especially one that branches like that, you better be ready for what's going to be coming down the road, because the buck is going to stop with you if you're going to have bugs or not, or if things are going to flow the way they're supposed to. And you're signing yourself up to test for all that. So just be ready.
Yeah, so as far as the actual process that we go through at the beginning of a development cycle, like I said, I set up all the tasks in ClickUp, and we typically try to take a week after we've had a release to just kind of sit back and reflect on what went well the previous release cycle, what we want to do differently the next release cycle. And like I said, just kind of get our head straight and get our brain organized, because the end of a development cycle and the beginning of a development cycle are so different in terms of your mentality and what you're working on, that at least for me, it takes me about a week to make that adjustment from, okay, we're in the mode of putting a release out versus, okay, we're now in the mode of starting a release from scratch. Like those are two totally different things. So I don't know if you want to talk more about like the process for Prince of Suburbia, because I feel like that's, as far as division of labor, while obviously I'm very involved in Prince of Suburbia, the kind of managing the workflow and kind of supervising the update from beginning to end is usually more your area.
Typically, like after we complete an update of Prince of Suburbia, after the dust settles a little bit, I'll start thinking about potential scenes that might be fun to see the characters with, given where we are in the story. And, we try to pick things that make sense with that. And that being said, we're near the end of the main story now. So basically everything is open on the table. Whereas, let's say, the first half of the game, Catherine couldn't really have just any willy-nilly scene because she wasn't at that point with the MC. So typically, when we are deciding upon the scenes, we also run it by Auxiliary Out, who is our artist for Prince of Suburbia. And he kind of helps provide his input so that we can figure out what scenes and what types of positions, etc., are workable and what are going to look good with animation, what kind of camera angles would be the best for the player, and then also for him to animate in a way that's going to be appealing and aesthetic. And then also what comes with that is, as many of you know, we have voice actress Hara Luna, who also voices a lot of the characters. And at this point, our plan and what we're going to execute is we're going to have almost all the lewd scenes in the game are going to be voiced by her as well. So that comes with that too. All of that has to be organized together. And then also on top of that, I have to take the writing that Jocelyn gives me, the script, and I have to take all those pieces together and assemble them when everything is ready into the update. And like we mentioned before, the Prince of Suburbia updates are not super complicated. However, in this update coming for 1.0, I have to retroactively go back to all the previous scenes that don't have all the voice acting, for example. I have to go back to the remastering scenes that we've been doing as well. And then I have to also code the update. And anytime that there's free roam, even though the game doesn't necessarily need it, as we've discussed in previous episodes, it does have it. It does add a layer of complexity that I have to contend with as well. Basically, my whole goal is to put it all together, make all the animations seamless, cut off at the right time, and then also make sure that there's no bugs. So I have to test the crap out of it before each release, because I don't want people to be disappointed. And then ultimately, when it gets to Steam, there's a whole nother thing that comes with that I'll mention later in this episode.
Yeah, like you said, we typically will sit down at the beginning of the update cycle and really nail down exactly what scenes we want to do. Sometimes we come up with multiple options for scenes that we would be happy with, and then we will pull those out. So when we do polls, it's not because we don't have any ideas of our own or we aren't sure which one we want to do. We always come up with multiple ideas that we would be happy with, that would work with our vision, and then we let the subscribers and patrons decide which of those we're going to put in the story. And something that we didn't mention, but kind of is like an overarching point, is that we already have the stories planned out, and we already have planned out for every update kind of generally what's going to happen. And so by the time we're at the beginning of the update cycle and we're nailing down exactly what scenes are going to be in it, it's not like we're just coming up with it out of thin air at that point. We already sat down long ago and mapped out both of the stories and how many updates they would have and what would happen generally in those updates. So it's not like we're just like, what should happen next? Like it's, I just want people to understand that it's more structured than that. It's more like, okay, here we are in the story. This is what's going on. Now we need to get down to the nitty gritty of like what specifically is going to happen in the scenes.
I just want to mention one other thing too that I've learned over this process with the two artists that we've had, which is essentially if you're not the artist making a 2D game, then even if for 3D art, I would imagine like you're going to want to provide actual references of what you're looking for the scenes to the artist so that they know what you're looking for, and you're not going to be disappointed when they send you the initial sketches or the finished product. That way you're just both on the same page and you know what to expect and what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's something that I did want to talk about in this episode, and this is a good moment to talk about it, which is that we have, I think, some unique perspectives as game developers because we've done both types of games. We've done a 2D hand-drawn game. We've done a 3D DAZ game. And so the workflow is very different with those as far as the art goes. Like you said, when you're not the one doing the art, there's a lot more communication that goes into getting the art that you want versus if you yourself are the artist, you don't have to communicate it to anybody. You know what you have in your mind, and it's just a matter of executing it. And so I think it's sometimes it's just one of those things that can be a trade-off. Having another person on your team can obviously be really helpful, especially if you yourself are not an artist. You don't necessarily have much of a choice at that point if you want hand-drawn art, but it does add an extra layer of time to have to communicate about what you want and go back and forth and make tweaks. And like you said, something that we've learned is that the more work we do up front to have a really specific vision of what we want, and like you said, have references and be able to describe it really in detail, the better product we get versus if we just kind of are like, well, we just generally want this to happen. And, you know, a lot of times what we can get back is very different than what we were imagining. Not that it's better or worse, but, you know, then that's more work for the artist than to have to go back and make it look more like what we wanted. And so that's on us as the developers with the vision to be really specific, unless we really don't have anything in mind. And then, you know, we can leave it open to the artist. And a lot of times Auxiliary Out will sketch maybe 2 or 3 different camera angles for us and let us decide what we like best if we don't know off the top of our heads. But obviously that's more time for him having to make those various sketches. So as far as the writing process goes for Prince of Suburbia, like I said, long ago we sat down and sketched out as far as the story goes and the main plot points and the main beats of the story. For each update, we've had those for a long time. So we usually sit down together and decide at the beginning of the update what specifically is going to happen in the scenes so that Auxiliary Out can get started on the art, because hand-drawn art and animation takes so long that it has to get started right away at the beginning of the update cycle. That one, again, the process is a little bit different than with A Shot in the Dark, but the writing happens at all different stages. Sometimes I write a scene before he's drawn it. Sometimes I'm writing the scene after he's drawn it, because it just really depends on where each of us are and how much time we have available and what we want to work on or what we have time to work on. We're always in constant communication though. Sometimes he will, ask me, hey, what's kind of going on in this scene as far as like what expressions should the characters have or whatever. Or sometimes he'll send something and I'll see their facial expressions and say, actually, for this, from a story standpoint, here's what's going on. So maybe their facial expressions should be different. So even if I haven't written the scene, I probably have a good idea of what's going to happen and the general things that they're going to say. So I can give him that feedback. Something that has added an extra layer is that we've hired outside writers to help with both games. And that's a situation where I've learned, again, that it doesn't necessarily save much time because I have to spend a lot of time communicating what I want from the scene. And again, I've gotten better with that as time has gone on about being more specific. Before, the very first time we hired something out, it was like, oh, here's the art. Now write a scene for it, because that's what I do, right? But like, I'm taking for granted that I already know the context and what's going to happen before and what happens after and all these nuanced things that the writer doesn't know. And so if I really want to set them up for success, then I need to write them a really detailed outline with lots of details and context about what it is exactly that I want. And if the art is not finished, then I need to give them really good references for what the art is going to look like. It's, I'm sure, easier for our outside writers to write it once the art is already complete, versus for me, it doesn't really matter because I generally know what the art is going to look like. So that's very different for Prince of Suburbia than A Shot in the Dark. A Shot in the Dark, we start off the same way. We sit down, we have a discussion about what we're going to have specifically in each scene. But then I always write it before I do the art because I'm the one who does the art. So, and with 3D art, it's different too, in that with 2D art, they're usually making like 1 illustration or 2 illustrations or, 1 or 2 animations. And then the rest of the scene will happen with sprites. Whereas with 3D rendering, I'm going to have to make a render essentially for everything that happens in the scene and every line of dialogue. And so for me, my workflow is definitely that I write it first. I have a good idea in my mind of what it's going to look like before I ever sit down to make the art. But I can imagine for teams where one person is doing the writing and the other person is doing the art, again, we kind of have that experience. I would assume that they probably have a similar thing where the person that writes it has to write it first before the 3D artist can do the art. However, we've talked about this. I would assume that writer probably has to write a lot of description of what is happening. Whereas I don't have to write that. I don't have to write he walks across the room or he does this or that because I already know what's happening. I just write the dialogue. I already know what's happening in my mind as far as where they're moving around and what's happening physically. So I don't have to write that down. But our outside writers, they do have to give me more information when they write a scene. And sometimes I have to make a judgment call on if I'm willing to do that with the art, because posing and 3D art is so time consuming that a lot of times I can't put all of the things they want to put in. Whereas when I'm writing, I'm already thinking ahead. Well, I don't want to have them change rooms because that's a lot of, I have to redo the posing and the lighting and the characters. So anyway, all that to say, like I said, I think we have kind of a unique perspective in some sense that we've done both, where we have a different writer and a different artist, and then same writer, same artist. And it is a very different workflow depending on which situation that you're in.
So as far as the 3D animation creation process goes, as with anything with game development or development in general, we've been tuning our process as we've gone along. So with A Shot in the Dark in the beginning, typically, from what I recall, you would give me scenes and the characters would be roughly in a position that might be suitable for animation. And then I would take them and pose them the way I would want them to be. And I would go through what I thought was the ideal animation process at the time. And that was when I was very much a beginner and hadn't done it since or before this Daz stuff with A Shot in the Dark. Now, at this point, you have taken more of the work on. So here in Chapter 4, the characters are pretty much in a pretty nice scene set up. You have all the camera viewpoints that you want set up. Even though you do set up the characters and the viewpoints with the cameras so that they're ready to be animated, I still have to tweak everything because one of the first things I do now when I'm checking the posing for the animations is to see what a hip thrust is going to look like with the current setup. And if it's not going to look good, then I have to move the characters around however that needs to be done. Same thing with any of the jiggle physics, if you will. That has to look good in my eyes, so I make tweaks with that. List goes on, but long story short, our process is getting more tuned, I feel like, as we get going along here with these chapters. And who knows, maybe the process will be really finely tuned by the time we're done with it and never touch it again.
Yeah, that's kind of that's the downside, is that we get really good at a particular process, like the process for Prince of Suburbia. I feel like we basically have the workflow down pat at this point because we've done so many updates now. It's a shame that the game is wrapping up and that we don't plan to do another 2D game exactly like this, because the reality is that yes, we've gotten very efficient at it, but we also get bored quickly and we like challenge. So I think that's part of it, is that because we've gotten so good at it, it's kind of not as challenging and it gets more boring, and it wouldn't be as fresh and fun if we were to basically just do a clone of this again and do the exact same thing, because it would just be so repetitive and routine. So I do like that we have these different workflows for the different games, but there's definitely a little bit where you're like, well, the next game, if we use a different engine, if we use a different, thing to make the art, then yeah, it's going to be a totally new process that we have to learn, and, we'll have to get better with each update. But yeah, with A Shot in the Dark, as I said, I always do the writing first, and then I do all the renders based on what I've written. And yeah, we've gotten a lot better with that, as far as me making renders and then thinking ahead about what the animations are going to be, and then providing you with a setup essentially that's already ready for animating. In the very beginning, I was still learning with Daz. And so I was like, well, I'll just, like you said, get them generally where I want them. But then I just didn't have the time or the, mental capacity to worry about more than that, because I was just having to struggle to get the renders done. Whereas now I have so much more experience in Daz than you do, because I do all of the renders. And not that the animations don't take time, but certainly you don't spend as much time moving cameras around, moving lighting around, and making the environments, choosing the outfits. That's all the parts that I do. So I've gotten faster at that, and that has given me more time and space to provide you with a better setup. And also, too, in the first couple chapters, I remember, we knew generally what was going to happen in the scene, and I would write the scene and I would make the renders for it. But when it came to the animations and what was going to happen during that part of the scene, I think if you play the game, it's pretty apparent that every chapter we're still kind of playing around with how we wanted to handle the lewd scenes, as far as like, where do we put the animations? How many things do we make renders for versus animations? How long are the scenes? How does the player navigate the scene? Does it just play out on its own, or do they have menu options? Like, these are all things that we've played around with and are very different from chapter to chapter, until I feel like chapter 3 and now in chapter 4, we have a really good workflow as far as planning out the lewd scenes and how we want them to be, and when we want to use different features. Whereas in the first couple chapters, that was where we lost a lot of time, was that I would write the scene, I would make the renders, but there would be kind of this like open space where it was like, okay, and the animations are going to go here, and I'll figure out what happens during that once you make the animations, because then I'll know what they look like, and then I'll know whether there should be dialogue or not or whatever. So then you would make the animations, and then I would write something for it, and then we'd put it in the code, and then we'd see it in the game, and I wouldn't like the way that it was, so I would have to tweak it. It was and oftentimes, I would have lots of dialogue, and then you would make animations where all of the animations, their faces are showing, and I don't like to have dialogue when their faces are showing, because for me that's immersion breaking to have them like talking when their mouths are clearly closed. I know for some developers that's not a deal breaker, but for me, it's just a pet peeve for me personally. So I don't like it. I feel like we lost so much time in that, and that you would make all these gorgeous animations, and there'd be like 10 different animations, and none of them worked with what I had written. So we've gotten so much better at, again, I've realized that's on me as the writer to be more specific about what I want, and also as the artist to give you animation setups that are already pretty much ready to go. And that way I know they're going to fit with exactly what I wrote. And I've even started telling you now, like, I need this many animations where their faces aren't showing so that I can have dialogue. All of that saves us time in the long run, because we don't have to spend a lot of time backtracking to polish things and change things because you did something a little bit different than what I had in mind. Like, we've gotten much better at getting on the same page about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was going to chime in with real quick is, now that you essentially set up the characters very much like how you're expecting them to be in the animation, it sets the tone, the vibe, if you will, for what I'm going to be doing with the animation. So I might add my little tweaks in there, but I'm not going to adjust it drastically, because now you're going to be able to know what to expect, and hopefully the flow is going to be better with that.
Yeah, I can already tell that this, chapter 3 was a huge step up in terms of efficiency. And with chapter 4, I can already tell that we're going to have very little where we will have to go back and change things once it's been coded. Whereas in the past, the process of like polishing and making sure that the scenes play out well and feel good and all that kind of just subjective stuff, it was hard to get that right the first time. And so we would spend a lot of time in that last month of coding, like going back and polishing and changing things. But now it's much easier for me to envision what I want ahead of time and know what it's going to look like once it's implemented, and be able to write it out from the very beginning, telling you exactly what I want, both from an animation perspective and from a coding perspective. So I don't know if you want to talk about kind of how you take my writing, my renders, the animations you've made, and how you put it together into an update.
So as far as taking everything together for a Shot in the Dark and putting everything together, we talked about before, it's a much more complicated process for a Shot in the Dark. We've even created scripts because it saves so much time, because we have so much going on in this. So for images, for example, I ended up creating a Python script in order to save myself time on that end to put that in the code base. For songs, Jocelyn picks those out, and, I put in placeholders in the code if we don't already have the song, for example, and then she'll go through if she needs to. As far as the writing goes, like, I'll work on an individual script, like scene setup that Jocelyn has for me, and I'll go step by step through that. And anytime there's branching, I'll have to look at previous variables that we have to check off of. And then I'll also have to create new variables, to track for choices that are made that are going to impact the MC or the player as they go on through the updates. And then one of the big pains in the ass is setting up the memories, which is, the typical RenPy gallery stuff. But there's just like so many animations and so many memories that we have in each update that it's a huge undertaking. And then, we have to put those images in and put all the code in, make sure it's working, set up sub menus when there's a ton of different views at different speeds. Another thing is the photos, like the photo reel. Like, anytime somebody's taking photos in the game, like, that is a separate code thing too. It's set up similar to the gallery, but it's also more code that has to be accounted for. So yeah, just keeping track of all that stuff, the texting, the photogram stuff, all that stuff are like, it's all extra features. It's all extra like brain power that you need to keep track of all that stuff. And this goes back to earlier in the episode where Jocelyn's talking about ClickUp. Like, I'm not a super organizational person, but for the really complex games on the organizational side, like a Shot in the Dark, like, I really feel like unless you are just a person who keep track of everything in your head, which I find would probably be really rare, like, you're going to need something like ClickUp to keep track of all that stuff to make sure you don't get lost in the sauce or forget stuff each update.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that is that, for example, for every single memory and for every single memory, we need like a little thumbnail, which is an image from the scene that goes into the gallery and then it's blurred out until you unlock that thing. One thing that because we use ClickUp, I can set a reminder for myself for every single scene when I make the renders. At that moment, when I'm already doing all the post work on the renders, I will choose in that moment the thumbnails that are going to be used for those memories. And I make the square versions, I make the blurred versions, I make all the things that we're going to need. And that way they're just ready to go when you code them, because previously, I would always forget about that, right? Because when I'm making the renders, I'm not thinking about the memory. Like, that's something that happens way down the road as far as you creating it. But what would happen is, like, I would make all the renders, then you would code it, and then you would go to create the memory, and then you'd have to make a placeholder because you didn't have the actual thumbnails. And then I would have to remember at some point to make those thumbnails. So I'd have to go all the way back to the renders and remember what's happening in the scene, what would be a good thumbnail for it. And then I have to do it and make it. And then I have to, it was just like, it sounds so simple and so stupid, but like, you can lose many hours of work that way, but just because you didn't do it at a better time and you waited until later on, you kicked the can down the road, and it'll cost you more hours later on to kind of remember to do it and then do it. And then you have to go back in the code and replace what was there and et cetera, and then make sure you're putting the right thumbnail in the right place. Like, all of this stuff loses time when, if we just do it right from if we do it right the first time, if we do it right from the beginning, we save time in the long run. So I feel like that's where, being organized is something that, is a strength of mine. And I feel like it helps us get more efficient with each update, in that our update cycles have stayed pretty much the same length, but we're getting much more content out in that same update cycle length.
And I just want to make an important point here that we've found, as we've been working on this game from the beginning to up to this point, which is, the reality is, if you do the main things well, you do not have to have a complex game to keep people around. The honest truth is, we probably put too much complexity in A Shot in the Dark, where we could have cut it down by a half or more of the complexity that's in there. Maybe we just would have a gallery and texting, and that was it, and that would have been probably perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think as we've mentioned before in prior episodes, we are definitely tryhards. And so we did this to ourselves. We made a very complex game that has lots of features. And so, every update cycle has many, many little tiny tasks that have to get done in order for all of those features to work. And we certainly didn't have to do all of those, but I think that we're the kind of people that enjoy that. We enjoy pushing ourselves and challenging ourselves. And then when we see it all put together, we're really happy with what we've created because we know how much work went into it. And something that we've talked about a lot too is that human beings like seeing the fruit of human labor, or like human potential. Like, we still like to see human beings race on foot, even though they could go faster in a car or on a bicycle, right? Like, we still like to just see humans reaching their full potential. And so I think that's something that a lot of players appreciate about A Shot in the Dark, is that it obviously has a lot of work and love and care put into it. And while we could have been just as successful without all of those things, it certainly shows how much we care and how much love and passion we have for making the best game that we possibly can. So just to kind of summarize how the whole update cycle goes, for Princess Suburbia, we start off choosing what general scenes are going to be in it. We tell the artist what scenes to do. And so we go back and forth with him as he creates the art. I write the scenes or work with the writers to get the scene written. And then if somebody else writes it, I have to edit it to be in my voice and to be something that I'm willing to put out there as the lead writer, as the supervisor. Once the art is complete, once everything is written, then it can be coded. And then after it's coded, it's tested. And then after it's tested, it's released. For A Shot in the Dark, it's obviously more complicated. It still starts off with us just brainstorming. Then I will go off and write, or hire out to a writer. And the same thing, I will edit it after they write it, make sure it's what I want. Again, I spend more time now as far as my writing, being really specific about what I want it to look like, so that we can save time down the road when it comes to actually implementing it into the code. Then I go into DAZ and I make all of the renders, which starts with creating the environment, which is like the scenery. I have to put the characters in outfits, pick their makeup, maybe change their hairstyle. I have to set up the scene. I have to actually pose them down to their little finger bones most of the time. And then I have to make sure the lighting looks good, make sure the camera angles look good. And I have to do that over and over and over and over again for every single render. Luckily, there's such a thing as batch rendering, so I can pose like a whole bunch of renders during the day, and then they render while we sleep. Or right now, we have renders rendering right next to us. And then once all that is done, you make the animations based on the render setups that I gave you. Once the animations and renders and writing are all done, then you start coding, and then coding is even more involved with A Shot in the Dark. It's not just the making the scene, but also, like you said, putting in all the texting content, the photos, the memories, and then once it's all coded, we test it and then we release. And then honestly, there's a lot we could say that goes into just releasing, as far as like making builds and all of the little nitty gritty that goes into promoting an update and creating announcements about it. But honestly, it's looking like that would be its own episode, since we've already talked for about a half an hour about this. So it just goes to show that there's so many things going on with an update. It's so much more than most developers talk about as far as their devlogs. I know that we typically give like, here's a render count, here's a word count, here's kind of generally what we worked on, but it would just be it would not be very exciting, and it would be a lot of time for us to detail out all the little tiny things that we're doing. And, then it would take time away from actually doing all those little tiny things. So just know that, it's more work than we ever anticipated, even though we knew it was going to be a lot of work. So unless you've done it, it's probably more work than you can ever imagine. And so just make sure to show the developers of the games that you love some love and support, because a lot of work and, blood, sweat, and tears goes into making every update.
So like Jocelyn was saying, there's a lot that goes into all this, and this episode's already gotten really long, so we'll save some of this content for a different episode. There's a whole lot, like she said, involved in the testing, bug fixing process, uploading the builds to the various platforms, and then Steam itself is its own beast when it comes to like everything that has to go into an update if you're in early access, for example. So yeah, we'll cover that in a future episode.
Yep, looks like this one will be a two-parter. So that brings us to the end of this first part, where we talked about what goes into the update cycle from the very beginning of creating the update to putting it all together and getting it ready for testing. So we hope that this sheds some light on the process, and we hope this was an interesting episode, and we will go into the rest of the process, like we said, in a future episode.
We want to thank our community for the questions, and if you have any topics you'd like us to explore, please reach out. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.